I never imagined that my vacation in Paris would turn into a nightmare. It all started that night when my boyfriend, David, and I decided to explore a restaurant we had stumbled upon by chance. The facade was discreet, with an old sign and soft lighting that contrasted with the vibrant nightlife of the city. It seemed like the perfect place for a romantic meal. Little did we know that dinner would be the beginning of our worst nightmare. As soon as we crossed the door, I felt a chill run down my spine. The atmosphere, though elegantly decorated, had something unsettling about it. The walls were covered in dark, intricately detailed wallpaper that seemed to absorb the dim candlelight from the tables. The soft music playing in the background had an eerie, almost hypnotic melody. It felt like the place was alive, watching our every move. The waiter, a tall, thin man with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, led us to a table at the back of the room. As we walked, I noticed that the other patrons, or what I thought were patrons, were watching us with empty, hollow eyes. It was as if they were trapped in their own minds, unable to interact with the world around them. The feeling of unease grew with every step. We sat down, and immediately a sense of claustrophobia took over me. The place felt smaller inside, and the walls seemed to close in around us. David tried to calm me, but I could see the concern in his eyes. We ordered wine and the main course, trying to ignore the growing feeling that something was terribly wrong. Minutes turned into hours. The service was absurdly slow, and every time we tried to get a waiter's attention, we were ignored. When we finally managed to speak to someone, our questions about the delay were met with sadistic laughter and soul-chilling looks. It was then that I realized there were no visible exits from the restaurant. The doors that had been clearly visible before now seemed to have disappeared, hidden by heavy, dark curtains. The atmosphere was suffocating. The air was heavy and filled with a metallic smell that I couldn't identify. I started to feel slightly dizzy, and my heart was racing. I looked at David and saw that he was experiencing the same thing. He stood up, determined to find a way out, but was immediately restrained by two staff members who appeared out of nowhere, with menacing smiles. Where do you think you're going?" One of them asked in a voice that seemed to echo through the room. David tried to argue, but his words fell on deaf ears. The situation was desperate, and fear began to turn into panic. My body felt paralyzed by adrenaline, unable to react properly. David was forced to sit down again, and the staff withdrew, but the sense of imminent danger remained. At that moment, I knew we were trapped. What started as a night of romance had turned into a dark nightmare. We were at the mercy of something much bigger and more sinister than we could have imagined. And so, our struggle for survival began, in a spiral of terror and despair. The claustrophobia we felt upon entering the restaurant only worsened as the minutes passed. David and I exchanged anxious glances, trying to stay calm, but the tension in the air was palpable. The environment, previously just uncomfortable, now felt oppressive, almost suffocating. The sadistic laughter of the staff still echoed in my mind, as if they were a dark warning of what was to come. David decided to act. He stood up again, this time with more determination, and walked towards the kitchen door. He tried to force his way through, but was immediately intercepted by two burly security guards who appeared out of nowhere. The struggle was brief and brutal. They threw him back to our table, and one of them approached me, leaning in dangerously close. "Sit down and enjoy your dinner," he whispered, his voice dripping with sarcasm and malice. "You're not going anywhere." The fear I felt turned into absolute dread. I desperately tried to think of a way to escape, but my body was paralyzed with terror. The eyes of the other patrons, previously empty, now looked at me with a mixture of pity and resignation. It was as if they were trying to warn me, without words, that there was no escape. In the midst of our despair, another couple, visibly disturbed, was dragged to a table next to ours. The woman was quietly crying, while the man looked around with an expression of defeat. When our eyes met, we exchanged a silent understanding. We were all trapped in that nightmare together. Time seemed to drag on. Every second, hope diminished. We tried again to get the staff's attention, but our pleas were ignored or met with that same cruel laughter. In a moment of desperation, David grabbed a table knife and tried to use it to force a window, but we discovered that the windows were fake, mere decorations with no connection to the outside. It was then that I realized the true nature of that place was much darker than we had imagined. We were forcibly taken to a restricted area at the back of the restaurant, where a hidden elevator took us to an underground floor. There, the reality of our nightmare was fully revealed. The basement was a labyrinth of narrow, dimly lit corridors, smelling of damp and mold. The walls were rough concrete, dirty and cold to the touch. We were separated and locked in individual cells, small and dark. The silence was broken only by the occasional sound of heavy footsteps and muffled screams coming from somewhere distant. In my cell, alone and powerless, fear turned into crushing despair. Every sound, every shadow, seemed like a threat. Hours passed slowly, and I began to lose track of time. The sporadic visits from the guards were moments of pure terror, as I tried to decipher their intentions through their impassive gazes. Then, during one of those visits, a guard let slip a fragment of conversation that chilled my blood. They were discussing the next event for which we would be used. It was then that I realized that restaurant was a front for something much more sinister, a cult that imprisoned tourists and turned them into slaves to satisfy the whims of billionaires at secret events. We were at the mercy of a cruel and calculating organization. The walls of my cell seemed to close in around me, and the reality of our fate became clearer. David was out there somewhere, and I could only hope he was planning something, anything, to get us out of that hell. Fear mingled with despair, but somewhere inside me, a small flame of resistance still burned. I couldn't give up, not while there was a chance, no matter how small, to escape that living nightmare. The time I spent in that cell seemed endless, each second stretched by the constant terror of not knowing what would happen next. Then, one day, the door to my cell opened with an ominous creak, and 2 guards entered. They dragged me through the labyrinthine corridors to a larger room, illuminated by cold fluorescent lights that made the environment seem even colder and more inhospitable. There, I saw David, dirty and exhausted, but alive. The relief of seeing him was instant, but brief, as the reality of our nightmare soon reasserted itself. In the center of the room stood a figure exuding authority and malevolence. A tall man with gray hair and icy cold eyes, dressed in an impeccable suit. He introduced himself as Victor, the leader of the cult. His voice was calm, almost soft, but it carried an implicit threat that chilled the bones. Welcome to our little piece of paradise, he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I know you have many questions, and I promise they will all be answered in due time. Victor began to tell us about the cult as if he were sharing a mundane story, an anecdote about everyday life. He explained that the restaurant was just a front for a dark organization that kidnapped tourists to satisfy the perverse desires of a billionaire elite. They held exclusive events where the prisoners were sold as slaves or used in sadistic games for the entertainment of the rich and powerful. As Victor spoke, I realized he enjoyed our suffering. It was a game for him, a spectacle of power and control. The coldness in his eyes as he described the horrors that awaited us was unbearable. I felt a wave of nausea and despair, but when I looked at David, I saw a fierce determination in his eyes. He wasn't willing to give up, and that gave me strength. We were taken back to our cells, but now the weight of the revelation crushed us. We knew our fate, and that made the wait even more terrifying. Every sound in the hallway, every movement of the guards, was a constant reminder of what was to come. One night, I was awakened by muffled screams. I looked through the small window of my cell and saw a group of prisoners being led down a side corridor. Among them, I recognized the couple who had arrived shortly after us. Their faces were marked by fear and resignation. They were taken to a room from which they never emerged. These disappearances were frequent, and each time someone was taken, a part of me died a little more. The psychological terror was relentless. The constant waiting and fear of being next were torturous. There was no rest, no peace. The cult knew how to break a person, how to destroy their will before inflicting physical pain. David, however, didn't give up. He started talking to other prisoners during the rare moments we were out of our cells. He discovered there was a resistance network among the captives, people who refused to accept their fate passively. These moments of connection, these small acts of defiance, were what kept hope alive, no matter how small. It was through this network that David began to formulate a plan. He knew the only way to save us was to destroy the cult from within. And to do that, he needed to infiltrate the organization, gain their trust, and find a weak point. It was an enormous risk, but the alternative was certain death. That night, as we whispered our plans to each other through the cell walls, I felt a mix of fear and hope. David was willing to risk everything to free us, and that gave me the courage I needed to face what was to come. The path ahead was uncertain and dangerous, but at least we had a purpose, a chance to fight against the terror that imprisoned us. And so, in the midst of that living nightmare, our resistance began. The fight for our freedom, against a cult that thought it had total control over our lives. The game was just beginning, and we were ready to fight to the end. The idea of David infiltrating the cult seemed insane, but it was our only hope. Time was running out, and the pressure was increasing every day. We knew that at any moment, we could be taken to one of the billionaire's events, where our fate would be sealed in a horrible and final way. David began to approach the guards and cult members, trying to gain their trust. He was clever, knowing exactly how to act and what to say to seem useful and loyal. He started volunteering for small tasks, showing obedience and subservience, but always observing, always planning. One night, while all the prisoners were locked in their cells, a guard came to get David. My heart nearly stopped. I tried to scream, but my voice failed. He was taken to an interrogation room where Victor was waiting. David would tell me later how his heart was pounding, but he maintained a calm exterior, knowing that moment was crucial. I've been watching you, Victor said, with that cold, calculated smile. You seem different from the others, more willing to cooperate. Is that true? David, knowing his life depended on his performance, responded firmly. Yes, sir. I understand my situation and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to survive. I want to be useful. Victor studied David for a long moment, in a silence that seemed eternal. Then, he smiled more sincerely, but still disturbingly. Very well. I'll give you a chance. Don't waste it. From that moment, David began working more closely with the cult members. He was assigned to help prepare for the events, where the prisoners were turned into a merchandise for the billionaires. The horror of watching and participating, even indirectly, in these preparations was indescribable, but David knew he had to keep up the facade to save us. He started passing information secretly to other prisoners, coordinating small acts of sabotage. They cut wires, broke equipment, and whenever possible, left false clues to mislead the cult members. Each small success was a step toward our freedom, but also increased the risk of being discovered. The tension was palpable. David couldn't allow his disguise to be uncovered, and at the same time, he needed to ensure that Jennifer and the others were ready to act when the right moment came. Every night, he returned to the cell with tired eyes, but still shining with determination. I, locked in my cell, fought against fear and despair. The reports from prisoners returning from a training were terrible, and the constant uncertainty was relentless psychological torture. Every time David was called for a new task, I feared it would be the last time I saw him. But he always returned, always with a new piece of information, a new thread of hope. Finally, the day of the big event arrived. It was our last chance. David had gathered enough about the cult's structure and vulnerabilities. He knew where the weak points were and how to exploit security flaws. With the help of other infiltrated prisoners, he devised a bold and dangerous plan. That night, chaos began to unfold. As the billionaires arrived for the event, the prisoners, led by David, started their rebellion. They cut the power, plunging the place into darkness. They took advantage of the confusion to attack the guards, using anything they could find as improvised weapons. I was one of the first to be freed. When the door to my cell opened and I saw David dirty, injured but determined, I felt a wave of relief and adrenaline. We ran through the labyrinthine corridors, avoiding the violent confrontations happening around us. The fight was intense. The prisoners were desperate, but David's determination inspired them. They knew this was their only chance for freedom. The guards, caught off guard, fought to maintain control, but the prisoners' revolt was fierce. Finally, we reached the control room. David, with the help of some prisoners who had worked there, managed to access the security systems and disable the locks on the exits. The doors that had been invisible now opened, revealing the long-awaited freedom. The final obstacle was Victor. He appeared, furious and desperate to maintain control. He confronted David, and the two engaged in a brutal fight. David, despite being exhausted, fought with the strength of someone who knew his life and many others depended on it. The blows were quick and precise, each carrying the accumulated anger and determination. While the fight continued, the other prisoners kept Victor's guards occupied. Finally, in a decisive move, David managed to disarm Victor and bring him down. The cult leader fell to the ground, unconscious. The battle seemed to be won. Quick, let's get out of here," David shouted, grabbing my hand and pulling me toward the exit. We ran through the corridors now lit only by emergency lights, avoiding the bodies of guards and injured prisoners. The night air of Paris had never felt so fresh and liberating. When we finally emerged onto the street, the relief was overwhelming. We were free, but forever marked by the horror we had lived through. The remaining prisoners followed, some crying with joy, others still in shock. David and I hugged, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. We knew that destroying the cult was just the beginning of a long recovery process. That night, under the stars of Paris, we made a silent pact to never let our trauma define us. We knew it would take time, but we were determined to rebuild our lives together. In the days that followed, the authorities were informed about the cult. The investigation revealed the extent of the crimes committed, shocking the world. The media seized the story, and the cult was completely dismantled. David and I testified against them, our testimonies helping to bring justice to those who had suffered. But even with justice served, the horrors we experienced left deep scars. The nights were difficult, the nightmares frequent. However, the strength of our love and determination to move forward helped us heal, little by little. Eventually, we turned our experience into a mission to help other survivors of similar traumas. We founded an organization to support victims of kidnapping and human trafficking, using our story to inspire and empower. And so, the night of terror that began in a restaurant in Paris turned into a journey of resilience and hope. The cult had broken us, but also forged us into something stronger. Together, David and I found peace, knowing that our love and our struggle had made a difference.